There is a particular silence that only a certain kind of person knows. It is not the silence of peace, not the stillness of a quiet evening, not the comfortable hush of a room where everyone is content and warm and at rest. It is the silence that descends after you have spoken something true, something genuinely, undeniably, achingly true, and the people around you have looked at you as though you had just committed an act of violence. You can feel it in your chest, that cold, hollow echo where warmth used to live. You said what was real. You pointed at what was plainly, visibly, unmistakably there. And instead of gratitude, instead of recognition, instead of even the most basic acknowledgement, you were met with changed expressions, with sudden distance, with the slow and unmistakable withdrawal of belonging. Perhaps it happened at a family table, where you named something that everyone had been carefully not naming for years, where the unspoken agreement to leave certain truths in shadow had become so ordinary that your speaking broke something people didn't even know they were protecting. Perhaps it happened among friends, when you refused to agree with the comfortable lie they were all telling each other, the flattering story they needed to believe about themselves or about someone they loved. Perhaps it happened in a workplace, a marriage, a circle of people you had known for years and thought knew you, loved you, welcomed you, and then, with a speed that still baffles you when you turn it over in your memory, you were on the outside, not expelled with drama or ceremony. That would have been easier, because at least it would have been honest. No, you were simply no longer included. The invitations stopped. The warmth cooled by degrees, so slow you almost didn't notice, until it was gone entirely. The space you once occupied quietly closed over itself, like water closing over a stone, as though you had never been there at all. If you recognize this feeling, and something deep in me suspects you do, or you would not have arrived here, to this particular corner of reflection, then I want to tell you something I believe with every fiber of what I have come to understand about the human soul across all the years of my writing and my suffering and my strange, difficult, illuminated life. You were not rejected because you were wrong. You were rejected because you were right. And that particular inversion, that specific cruelty of existence, is so strange, so difficult, so contrary to everything we are taught to expect about the relationship between truth and belonging, that most people spend their entire lives fleeing the awareness that would require them to sit with it. I am Fyodor Dostoevsky. I wrote about hell from the inside. I spent 4 years in a Siberian prison camp for the crime, essentially, of attending meetings where inconvenient ideas were spoken aloud. I watched men break, and men endure, and men discover resources of spirit in themselves they never knew existed until everything else was stripped away. I stood before a firing squad and heard the death sentence read, and waited for the shot that did not come, a mock execution designed to shatter the convictions of those who had spoken inconveniently. And what it did instead was sharpen in me something I have never since been able to dull: the absolute certainty that the human soul, confronted with the full enormity of its situation, becomes capable of something no comfortable life can produce. When I returned from that camp and wrote again, I was not the same man who had written before. I was a man who had seen what happens when the truth is stripped of all its comfortable packaging and offered raw, without ornamentation or apology, to people who were not prepared to receive it. And I found, across all the years that followed, that this was the story I could not stop telling, because it was the most essential one I knew. What happens to a person who cannot stop seeing what others have decided not to see? What becomes of the soul that insists on truth in a world that has built its entire social architecture around the collective, quiet, endlessly renewable agreement to avoid it? You are not broken. You are not difficult in the way they implied when they withdrew. You do not lack some essential social grace that would have allowed you to be loved unconditionally. Those who cast you out would love for you to believe those things about yourself, not always out of conscious malice, but because your believing it serves a function that is deeply convenient for them. If the problem is you, if the difficulty is your manner, or your intensity, or your inexplicable inability to simply let things lie, then the truth you carried can be safely buried along with your credibility. The exile is not a punishment for your failure. It is a defense mechanism of the group. It is a strategy as old as human community. Isolate the one whose presence makes the shared fiction unstable, and the fiction survives. Understand this not as bitterness, but as clarity, because clarity about what happened to you is the only foundation from which genuine healing can begin. What the world calls social harmony is, in most cases, a carefully maintained agreement about what will not be said. Human beings are extraordinary creatures, capable of tremendous love and tremendous self-deception simultaneously. And one of the things they are most gifted at is constructing shared fictions, stories about themselves, about their relationships, about the nature of their circumstances, that allow life together to proceed without confrontation. These fictions are not always conscious or deliberate. More often, they are simply inherited, passed down through families and institutions and cultures as an unspoken understanding of where the boundaries of permissible thought are drawn. For most people, those boundaries feel entirely natural, the way the walls of a house you were born inside feel natural. You do not notice them. You do not experience them as limitations at all. They feel rather like the shape of reality itself. And this is precisely what makes them so powerful and so difficult to challenge. The group does not need to make a conscious decision to exile the truth speaker. The expulsion happens almost automatically, the way a body rejects a foreign object, because the presence of someone who will not agree to the collective silence disrupts the entire emotional economy on which the group depends. The comfortable lie requires unanimous participation to maintain its power. One dissenting voice does not merely disagree, it reveals that the lie is a lie, which means everyone who has been maintaining it is revealed as someone who chose comfort over honesty. This is intolerable to most people, not because they are bad, but because the human capacity for self-deception has limits, and the person who insists on accuracy forces those limits to be confronted. And so, they remove the source of discomfort, not you, your ideas, your perceptions, your inconvenient accuracy. But since those things live inside you, removing them means removing you. But then there are those who see the walls, those for whom the seams have always been slightly visible, the construction always slightly exposed, the elaborate effort behind the apparent naturalness always just a little too apparent to fully ignore. And in everything I wrote, I tried to trace what happens to those people. because their fate illuminates something essential about being human that the comfortable majority would rather not examine. And I have always been more interested in what people would rather not examine than in anything else. Consider Raskolnikov, the young man at the center of crime and punishment. What drove him was not simply poverty, not simply the intellectual vanity of a university student who has read too much philosophy and too little lived experience. What drove him was a mind that could not stop perceiving the real nature of the world around him, the corruption layered beneath the formal surfaces of society, the way the comfortable classes managed to feel virtuous while the desperate suffered at their feet, the hypocrisy woven so deeply into every social interaction that most people could no longer detect it as hypocrisy at all. His suffering was the suffering of clear sight in a world that had decided not to see clearly, and what he could not do, what he lacked the inner resources and the love to do, was integrate that truth, bear it, carry it without being consumed by it. His crime was not the expression of his insight, it was the flight from it. He wanted power over the truth he had seen, because witnessing it clearly and doing nothing felt unbearable. And so, he attempted to become an actor in it rather than merely a perceiver, and in doing so, he destroyed himself more completely than any external force could have managed. This is the first and most seductive trap for the person who sees truly, the conversion of witness into judge, of perception into power. Now consider Prince Mishkin in The Idiot. Here is a man who speaks truth with the simplicity of someone who does not fully grasp that there is a cost to doing so, a social tax levied on those who refuse to filter what they see before sharing it. He says what he observes. He loves without calculation or self-protection. He perceives the interior life of everyone around him with a delicacy that is almost unbearable to witness, because it is never deployed strategically. It is simply what he does, what he is, the way his consciousness works. And what does the world do with him? It calls him an idiot. It finds him charming in small and controlled doses, and deeply, existentially threatening when encountered for too long, because his presence is a kind of mirror that shows people themselves without flattery. He is welcomed into the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg just enough to be useful and entertaining, and excluded whenever his honesty becomes genuinely inconvenient. His fate is not the result of weakness or failure. It is the direct and inevitable consequence of uncorrupted perception encountering a world that requires, at every social turn, a certain percentage of corruption simply to function. And then there is the underground man, perhaps the figure who cost me the most, because he is the one I understood most intimately, not as invention, but as confession. This man sees everything. He sees the vanity that presents itself as generosity, the cruelty nestled inside propriety, the way human beings perform their lives for an audience they spend their entire existence simultaneously seeking and despising. He sees all of it with relentless, exhausting, comprehensive accuracy, and it has made him impossible, not because what he sees is wrong, but because he has allowed the knowledge to curdle into something else entirely, into bitterness, into a corrosive and ultimately self-defeating sense of superiority over the very humanity whose recognition he still desperately, secretly craves. He uses what he knows not to understand or to love or to connect, but to maintain the elevation of the observer, to keep himself at the cool and ironic distance that protects him from ever being truly touched. The underground man is the warning at the center of my philosophy. He is what the truth seer becomes when the gift of perception is never disciplined by love, when seeing clearly is divorced from caring about what is seen, when the exile, instead of deepening the soul, simply calcifies it. And then there is Ivan Karamazov, that brilliant and tortured man who argues with God and loses, not the argument, because his arguments are flawless, logically airtight, genuinely devastating, but himself. Ivan sees the suffering of the world with absolute clarity. He can articulate injustice with a precision that leaves no room for comfortable evasion. His famous rebellion against the suffering of innocent children is not wrong. It is not made of weak reasoning or shallow sentiment. It is the product of a mind that has looked at what is real without flinching and found it unbearable. But Ivan's tragedy is that his clarity becomes a wall rather than a door. His ability to see the darkness of the world without the counterbalancing force of active love leaves him stranded in his perception, unable to move through it toward anything. He collapses not because his insights were false, but because insight without love is, eventually, a form of darkness all its own. What Alyosha has, the capacity his brother lacks, is not the absence of Ivan's perceptions, but a different relationship to them. Alyosha sees the same suffering. He does not look away, but he also does not stop there. He moves toward it rather than cataloging it from a distance. And this movement, small and human and unglamorous as it often appears beside Ivan's magnificent intellectual revolt, is the thing I believed most deeply in. There is a razor's edge that people of clear sight must learn to walk, and I do not minimize how sharp it is, how easy it is to fall from it in either direction, toward the withdrawal of Mishkin's helplessness, or the corrosion of the underground man's contempt, or the paralysis of Ivan's brilliant despair. The capacity to see truly, to perceive what others have agreed not to perceive, is not itself either a gift or a curse. It is a raw faculty. What it becomes depends entirely on what you do with it, on whether you can hold it with something that resembles what Father Zosima called active love. Not the love of sentiment or theory, but the love that requires the actual, difficult, daily choice to remain open to others even when everything you see about them would justify closing yourself off. Now, I want to speak to the specific wound of the exile, because it is not merely an abstract or philosophical condition. It lives in the body. It changes the way you enter rooms. It makes you preemptively smaller in situations where once you were simply yourself, because some part of you has learned, through accumulated experience, that the cost of being fully yourself can be expulsion. And so you begin to self-censor in ways so habitual you no longer notice them. You edit before you speak. You watch for the signs of discomfort in those around you and adjust your presentation accordingly, trimming and moderating and softening until what comes out of you is a version so carefully managed that it barely resembles what you actually know or feel or see. And this particular adaptation to the experience of having been cast out is in many ways more damaging than the exile itself, because the exile was done to you, but the self-silencing is something you do to yourself. It is the internalization of the demand for your diminishment, and it is the thing I most want to speak against. Dostoevsky did not offer the comforting lie that speaking the truth will ultimately be rewarded in obvious, measurable, worldly ways. It would be dishonest to offer that comfort, and I have never found dishonesty to be genuinely comforting in the end. What I offer instead is this: the truth you carry has a life independent of whether the people around you are currently willing to receive it. It was true when you saw it. It is true now. It will be true after everyone who rejected you for speaking it has moved on to whatever comfortable fiction comes next. And your relationship to that truth, your fidelity to it, your willingness to continue living in its company, even when the company it brings you socially is sparse, that relationship is the foundation of the only kind of self-respect that cannot be taken away by someone else's decision to exclude you. The path through the wound is not around it. I never believed in paths that go around. The grief of having been cast out for your integrity is real grief, and it deserves to be experienced as such, not performed, not suppressed, not immediately converted into philosophical understanding in order to avoid feeling it. There is a temptation, and I understand it completely, to turn the pain of exile into a theory almost immediately, to retreat into the intellectual frame before the emotional reality has had its full duration. It is easier to understand what happened than to feel what it meant to you. But the understanding that comes before the feeling is always incomplete, always a little armored, always protecting something that has not yet been fully seen. Feel it first. Let it show you what it actually knows. Not what your fear says it knows. Not what the voices of those who expelled you say it knows. Because their voices will offer you interpretations that serve their interests, that position the rejection as something you brought upon yourself by being too much, too strange, too honest in ways that felt like aggression. None of those interpretations are the lesson. The grief itself is the lesson, if you will let it speak, rather than rushing to silence it with meaning. Feel it. Let it show you the specific people whose belonging you actually trusted and who withdrew it. Let it show you what you hoped for and what was actually on offer, how large the gap was between those two things, and how long you managed not to see the gap because seeing it would have required acknowledging the loss. This grieving is not weakness. It is the exact opposite. The refusal to protect yourself from the truth of your own experience. And in that refusal, there is a kind of dignity that the comfortable have no access to. And when the grief has been given its due, something else becomes possible. Not the naive return to openness, not the forgetting of what you learned about the conditions attached to the acceptance of those particular people, but a movement toward a different kind of presence in the world, one that no longer needs the approval of those who required your silence as the price of your belonging, because you have discovered through the extremity of the loss that you survived without it, that you are still here, that the self that remained after the belonging was withdrawn was more real, more essentially you, than the version that had been carefully managing itself to remain included. There are people in this world who do not require your diminishment as the condition of your welcome. They are fewer than we wish, but more than despair tells us. They have usually been expelled themselves in one form or another, and they bear the particular kind of openness that comes from having had their false belongings stripped away. When you find them, and the finding is rarely quick or easy, the quality of the connection is entirely unlike what you experienced in the groups that required your performance. It is honest in a way that is almost startling at first, because you have been so long in the habit of managing yourself that simple directness feels strange. But it is real, and real, as I wrote in 100 different ways across a lifetime of novels, is worth almost any cost. Do not let what happened to you become the central story you tell about yourself. Let it be part of the story, an important part, a formative part, a part that shaped your understanding in ways that cannot be undone and should not be. But the person who was cast out for telling the truth is not defined by the casting out. They are defined by the truth they refused to abandon. That refusal is the thing worth carrying forward. That is what the exile actually gave you, beneath all the pain of it. The proof that you could not be persuaded to lie by the withdrawal of belonging. That when it came to the essential choice between comfort and honesty, you chose honesty, even though you didn't know at the time that a choice was being made, even though no one framed it as a choice, even though you would have given a great deal not to have had to choose at all. Dostoevsky did not believe in resolutions that cost nothing. My novels do not end with everyone reconciled, and the light triumphant, and the wounded simply healed. They end with people who have passed through something real and been changed by it, marked by it, sometimes permanently altered by it, but capable now of a quality of seeing and of loving that was not available to them before the passage. That is the only transformation I trust, not the kind that arrives by avoiding the difficulty, but the kind that emerges from entering it fully and discovering in the depth of it that the soul is larger than what it feared. You were cast out because nobody wanted the truth, but you are still here. You are still awake to what is real. You are still capable of seeing what others have agreed to leave in shadow. That capacity did not leave you when the group did. It was never theirs to take. And if you can hold it now, not as a burden, not as proof of your isolation, but as the most honest thing you know about yourself, then the exile was not the end of your story. It was the chapter where you discovered what kind of person you actually are when everything that required you to be smaller has finally fallen away. That is not a consolation prize for the belonging you lost. It is something far more rare and far more durable than belonging ever was, and it will be with you long after every group that required your silence has restructured itself around its next convenient fiction. If something in this found you in a place you recognize, I ask you to speak it in the comments, not to perform the pain, but because the honesty you offer freely may be precisely what tells someone else, in their particular exile, that they are not alone, that they were not expelled because they were broken, that they were expelled because they were right, and the world was not yet ready to bear it. Subscribe for more of these reflections on the soul's deepest and most necessary territories. And in the next video, we will go further into what becomes possible when the loneliness of clear sight stops being only a wound and begins to be understood as a kind of calling. I am grateful you were here. Hold what you carry carefully. It matters more than you yet know.